Part 2. So we don't even need to do that. We'll just go right to there. Hello, Brobs. We're back with the poet Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel by Jerome McGann. Obviously, a book of explication on the man, the legend, the doom-laden poet. The poet Edgar Allan Poe. This is the second half of chapter 1. I think we're 50 pages in, now 43. I don't really remember where we left off. I'm going to guess right there, since that's how I do it. What's that say? Marginalia, November 1844. 9 and 10. All the Bridgewater treatises have failed in noticing the great idiosyncrasy in the divine system of adaptation. The idiosyncrasy which stamps the adaptation as divine in distinction from that which is the work of merely human constructiveness. I speak of the complete mutability or the mutuality of adaptation. For example, in human constructions, a particular cause has a particular effect. A particular purpose brings about a particular object. But we see no reciprocity. The effect does not react upon the cause. The object does not change relations with the purpose. In divine constructions, the object is either object or purpose, as we choose to regard it, while the purpose is either purpose or object, so that we can never abstractedly, without concretion, without reference to facts of the moment, decide which is which. For secondary example, in polar climates, the human frame, to maintain its due caloric, requires for combustion in the stomach the most highly ammoniac food, such as train oil. Again, in polar climates, the sole food afforded man is the oil of abundant seals and whales. Now, whether is oil at hand because imperatively demanded? Now, whether is oil at hand? The hell does that mean? Now, whether is oil at hand because imperatively demanded? Or whether is it the only thing demanded because the only thing to be obtained? It is impossible to say. There is an absolute reciprocity of adaptation, for which we seek in vain among the works of man. The Bridgewater Tractists, I thought it was a treatise. Before it was a treatise. The Bridgewater Tractists may have avoided this point, an account of its apparent tendency to overthrow the idea of cause, in general, consequently of a first cause, of God, but it is more probable that they have failed to perceive what no one preceding them has, to my knowledge, perceived. The pleasure which we derive from any exertion of human ingenuity is in the direct ratio of the approach to this. Let's say that again. Direct ratio of the approach to this species of reciprocity between cause and effect. In the construction of plot, for example, in fictitious literature, we should aim at so arranging the points or incidents that we cannot distinctly see in respect to any of them, whether that one depends from any one other or upholds it. In this sense, of course, perfection of plot is unattainable, in fact, because man is the constructor. The plots of God are perfect. The universe is a plot of God. What the hell did any of that mean? Is that from Poe himself? Yeah, I think so. Great attention has been paid to the document for the light it sheds on Poe's celebrated theory and method of fictional form and the requirement of a carefully constructed plot. The universe is a plot of God, Poe observes, and the remark is understandably aligned with Poe's many comments on the need for unity of effect in imaginative compositions, prose as well as poetry. His most extensive remarks on the matter come in his 1842 review of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, for example. In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. The ideal compositional form reflects the artist's pursuit of perfection, the desire of the moth for the star. In this marginalium, however, Poe goes further, for he wants to explain the dynamic form of a perfected plot, how it actually functions. Its decisive feature is what he calls reciprocity. With Babbage's Ninth Bridgewater Treatise most in mind, it would help if I knew who Ninth Bridgewater Treatise was or who Babbage was. Poe is deconstructing the traditional idea of the relation between cause and effect, both in general and with respect to imaginative works. In the traditional view, the effect does not react upon the cause, whereas in divine constructions, the object is either object or purpose, as we choose to regard it, while the purpose is either purpose or object, so that we can never abstractedly, without concretion, without reference to facts of the moment, decide which is which. So, with the construction of plot in literary works, Poe observes that we should aim at so arranging the points or incidents that we cannot distinctly see in respect to any of them, whether that one depends from any one other or upholds it. This perfection of form is the idea of pursuit of all art, even though, as he adds, it is unattainable in fact, because man is the constructor. Babbage and the other Bridgewater Tractists do not recognize this principle of reciprocity, possibly on account of its apparent tendency to overthrow the ideas of cause in general, consequently, of a first cause of God. For Poe, it overthrows neither the idea of cause nor of a first cause, but it definitely throws both into an entirely new frame of reference. This is kind of just mishmash bullshit, ain't it? With respect to imaginative compositions specifically, we can see why Poe told Lowell in a letter of October 19th, 1843, that poetry must eschew narrative, except, as you say, dramatically. The problem lies in the connecting links. That a narrative poem requires links that inevitably signal a structure organized as a cause effect sequence rather than as a structure of reciprocities. From their very explanatory nature, Poe says these links must be avoided by true poetry, the highest poetry. He then cites Byron as a poet who sought to overcome the problem of traditional narrative. Byron fractured his narratives into fragmentary passages eked out with asterisks, a move that Poe regards as effective, if also for him rather jerry-rigged and inartistic. I note in passing that Byron's method would exfoliate in a host of 20th century collage works like The Wasteland and Hugh Selwyn Mauberley. I also observe in anticipation that Poe's poetry itself often works from a structure that is fundamentally collage. Al Araf is clearly a collage work. A month after he published this Marginalium, Poe wrote a commentary on the contemporary romantic narrative Undine, where he finds a more artistic management of the transitions from subject to subject. In the tale, Undine and Bertalda travel together down the Danube, an event, Poe adds, that would have tormented the skill of an ordinary novelist to find a sufficient motive for the voyage. Not so Lamotte Fouque, who represents the reciprocity of forces at work. In this grateful union of friendship and affection, winter came and passed away, and spring, with its foliage of tender green and its heaven of softest blue, succeeded to gladden the hearts of the three inmates of the castle, i.e., Huldbrand, Bertalda, and Undine. What wonder then that its storks, the hell kind of, that its storks and swallows. Oh, I see. He's actually talking about animals. That its storks and swallows, I thought he was using them as verbs, inspired them also with a disposition to travel. Marginalia, December 1844. In a passage not quoted by Poe, Lamotte Fouque's, and I don't know how to say that, but that's my best guess, text itself explicates the reciprocity. The season was in harmony with their minds, and their minds imparted their own hues to the season. Poe then proceeds to further illustrations of his point. How exquisitely artistic is the management of imagination. So visible is the passage where the brooks are water spirits and the water spirits brooks, neither distinctly either. We shall observe that precise kind of effect throughout Poe's poetry. It is not a type of poetic ambiguity or a form of metaphor, however. It is rather a kind of schizoid vision. The relation of the two terms does not work toward their synthesis. Coleridge's theory of poetic symbolism as the balance and reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities. Biographical Literaria, chapter 14. Poe's effort is to produce texts that further individuate the terms. The result is not a synthesis of the terms, but a fission that generates further possible sets of relation, what he called novel combinations of combinations. One further comment on this marginalium seems important to make, that Poe calls the universe a plot of God, not the plot. The remark implies the existence of multiple universes, a thought that Eureka will pursue in detail, and where the further implication is also pursued that the plots of God are conceived by particular human beings, in these cases by Poe. Twice in the Marginalia, Poe quotes the Baron de Byfield approvingly to the effect that one must be God to understand God. Poe's God is created in the image and likeness of man, or rather in the image and likeness of Poe, a distinction of some consequence given the unholy mess of Poe's known life. Poe's view of God needs clarification. While a very secular view, it nonetheless draws upon the historical emergence of Christian thought, where the humanity of God is the central focus. Poe frequently represents an identity between God and man, not at least at the climax of Eureka. And in making that move, he draws upon the secular thought of one of his chief influences, Shelley. Both God and man are figures of creative action, but Poe, like Shelley, focuses on creative action as it appears in a mortal perspective. That is to say, it is action subject to what Shelley called chance, death, and mutability. The clogs of that which else might oversoar the loftiest star in unascended heaven, pinnacled dim in the intense inane. Prometheus Unbound 3. That view drove Poe to take an unusual and highly significant approach to the question of primary creation. How the universe of stars began for Poe is strictly speaking unknowable. Because material existence is a fact, however, Poe takes the deist idea that as omnipotent watchmakers set the clock of time going as an assumption that is both necessary and useful. He finds it useful exactly because it allows him to approach the problem as an artistic rather than a theological or philosophical problem. He is strictly speaking not very interested in God, but like Shelley is intensely interested in poetry and its creative function in the mortal world. I mean, what other world of poetry is there? Is there an immortal world? Come on now. This leads him to set the syntax and vocabulary of deity at the center of his poetry and poetics. We have no better example of how he does this than in the celebrated theoretical essay, The Philosophy of Composition, where the poet appears as an omnipotent deity with respect to his work. In this respect, we might say that Poe is an atheist, as Shelley declared himself, but he is only an atheist in a very special sense, a sense that is closer to the theist Blake than to the atheist Shelley. The God of philosophy and theology in the traditional churches is for him a multiply, dispersed historical reality. Poe is interested in that God and his historical appearances as material for his poetic representation, strictly as language. The rest is either silence or as in El Araf and the so-called angelic dialogues, a scene where we may watch human beings struggling to understand the nature of human creativity. Marginalia, March 1846. Some Frenchman, possibly Montaigne, says, people talk about thinking, but for my part, I never think, except when I sit down to write. It is this never thinking unless we sit down to write which is the cause of so much indifferent composition. But perhaps there is something more involved in the Frenchman's observation than meets the eye. It is certain that the mere act of indicting, lost connection there. But perhaps there is something more involved in the Frenchman's observation than meets the eye. It is certain that the mere act of indicting tends in a great degree to the logicalization of thought. Whenever, on account of its vagueness, I am dissatisfied with the conception of the brain, I resort forthwith to the pen for the purpose of obtaining, through its aid, the necessary form, consequence, and precision. Am I even connected to this anymore? Probably not. How very commonly we hear it remarked that such and such thoughts are beyond the compass of words. Whoa! Such thoughts are beyond the compass of words. There we go. Such thoughts are beyond. Can you stop now? Thank you. I do not believe that any thought, properly so called, is out of the reach of language. I fancy, rather, that where difficulty in expression is experienced, there is in the intellect which experiences it a want either of deliberateness or of method. For my own part, I have never had a thought which I could not set down in words with even more distinctness than that with which I conceived it. As I have before observed, the thought is logicalized by the effort at written expression. There is, however, a class of fancies of exquisite delicacy which are not thoughts, and to which, as yet, I have found it absolutely impossible to adapt language. I use the word fancies at random, and merely because I must use some word, but the idea commonly attached to the term is not even remotely applicable to the shadows of shadows in question. They seem to me rather physical than intellectual. They arise in the soul, alas, how rarely, only at its epochs of most intense tranquility, when the bodily and mental health are in perfection, and at those mere points of time where the confines of the waking world blend with those of the world of dreams. I am aware of these fancies only when I am upon the very brink of sleep, with the consciousness that I am so. I have satisfied myself that this condition exists but for an inappreciable point of time. Yet it is crowded with those shadows of shadows, and for absolute thought there is demanded time's endurance. These fancies have in them a pleasurable ecstasy as far beyond the most pleasurable of the world of wakefulness or of dreams as the heaven of the Northman theology is beyond its hell. I regard the visions, even as they arise, with an awe which, in some measure, moderates or tranquilizes the ecstasy. I so regard them through a conviction which seems a portion of the ecstasy itself, that this ecstasy in itself is of a character supernal to the human nature, is a glimpse of the spirit's outer world, and I arrive at this conclusion, if this term is at all applicable to instantaneous intuition, by a perception that the delight experienced has as its element, but the absoluteness of novelty. I say the absoluteness, for in these fancies, let me now term them cycle impressions. There's really nothing even approximate in character to impressions ordinarily received. It is as if the five senses were supplanted by five myriad others alien to mortality. That sounds like a bunch of bullshit. Now, so entire am my faith in the power of words that at times I have believed it possible to embody even the evanescence of fancies, such as I have attempted to describe. In experiments with this end in view, I have proceeded so far as first to control, when the bodily and mental health are good, the existence of the condition. That is to say, I can now, unless when ill, be sure that the combination will supervene, if I so wish it, at the point of time already described of its supervention. Until lately, I could never be certain, even under the most favorable circumstances. I mean to say merely that now I can be sure, when all circumstances are favorable, of the supervention of the condition, and feel even the capacity of inducing or compelling it. The favorable circumstances, however, are not the less rare, else had I compelled already the heaven into the earth. I have proceeded so far, secondly, as to prevent the lapse from the point of which I speak, the point of blending between wakefulness and sleep, as to prevent at will, I say, the lapse from this border ground into the dominion of sleep. Not that I can continue the condition, not that I can render the point more than a point, but that I can startle myself from the point into wakefulness, and thus transfer the point itself into the realm of memory. Convey its impressions, or more properly their recollections, to a situation where, although still for a very brief period, I can survey them with the eye of analysis. For these reasons, that is to say, because I have been enabled to accomplish thus much, I do not altogether despair of embodying in words at least enough of the fancies in question to convey to certain classes of intellect a shadowy conception of their character. In saying this, I am not to be understood as supposing that the fancies or psychal impressions to which I allude are confined to my individual self, are not, in a word, common to all mankind, for on this point it is quite impossible that I should form an opinion. But nothing can be more certain than that even a partial record of the impressions would startle the universal intellect of mankind by the supremeness of the novelty of the material employed and of its consequent suggestions. In a word, should I ever write a paper on this topic, the world will be compelled to acknowledge that at last I have done an original thing. If anybody understood that, explain it. This marginalium is one of the central tensions in Poe's work, regularly engaged as the divide separating his critical prose from his poetry, or the ratiocinative from the fantastical in his fictional work. Poe recovers that very distinction here. On one hand, there is thinking and conceptions of the brain, on the other, a class of fancies, which are not thoughts and to which as yet I have found it absolutely impossible to adapt language. The problem for Poe is strictly functional. I do not believe that any thought properly so called is out of the reach of language. If expression fails, the problem, I fancy, is a want either of deliberateness or of method. Why then the problem with those fancies? Or rather, and this is the purport of the marginalium, what is one to do about it? The answer, verbalize it, I fancy, drops casually into Poe's initial ratiocinative discussion, only to emerge as the full-blown fancies of the third paragraph. Having found a word, however, inadequate for the shadows of shadows that he wants to understand and master, he tracks them to their location, where he is most aware of them, in that hypnagogic region upon the very brink of sleep. Thus located, the problem they represent becomes more clear. They are fleeting, whereas for absolute thought there is demanded time's endurance. Poe, therefore, stays with his problem because the problem has now become immediate. It is the problem of carrying the thinking in this very marginalium over to the power of adequate words. As the discussion proceeds, his fancies become visions and cycle impressions, cycle, that produce a glimpse of the spirit world. While he does not mention poetry, it is obvious that the language of these fancies is properly the language of poetry, as he understands it. But Poe does not shift the discussion to poetry because the problem is a problem of expository prose. As his final sentence averrs, fully executed, the marginalium would become a paper on this topic. In point of historical fact, Poe would write that paper 2 years later. He calls it Eureka. This marginalium is a kind of prospectus for devising a method to control what Shelley called the vanishing apparitions that haunt the interlunations of life. In experiments with this end in view, Poe reports some success in arresting the hypnagogic point between wakefulness and sleep, and thus transfer the point itself into the realm of memory, convey its impressions, or more properly, their recollections, to a situation where I can survey them with the eye of analysis. Poe does not say that he wrote up a report on those successful experiments, and we have no record that he did. But here he conveys them into the realm of memory, adding an account to a long history of reports that date back to Aristotle and forward to current research in cognitive psychology. Eureka will not be a prospectus or a report. It will be a performative demonstration of the power of words, to cast fanciful thoughts into a stream of memory where they are thrown open to a reader's experience, initially affective, secondarily analytical. Letter to James Russell Lowell, July 2nd, 1844. My dear Mr. Lowell, I can feel for the constitutional indolence of which you complain, For it is one of my own besetting sins. I am excessively slothful and wonderfully industrious by fits. There are epochs, when any kind of mental exercise is torture, and when nothing yields me pleasure but solitary communion with the mountains and the woods, the altars of Byron. I have thus rambled and dreamed away whole months, and awake at last to a sort of mania for composition. Then I scribble all day and read all night, so long as the disease endures. This is also the temperament of P. Cook, of V., the author of Florence Vane, young Rosalie Lee, and some other sweet poems, and I should not be surprised if it were your own. Cook writes and thinks as you, and I have been told that you resemble him personally. I am not ambitious, unless negatively I now and then feel stirred up to exact a fool, merely because I hate to let a fool imagine that he may excel me. Beyond this, I feel nothing of ambition. I really perceive that vanity about which most men merely prate, the vanity of the human or temporal life. I live continually in a reverie of the future. I have no faith in human perfectibility. I think that human exertion will have no appreciable effect upon humanity. Man is now only more active, not more happy, not more wise than he was 6,000 years ago. The result will never vary, and to suppose that it will is to suppose that the foregone man has lived in vain, that the foregone time is but the rudiment of the future, that the myriads who have perished have not been upon equal footing with ourselves, nor are we with our posterity. I cannot agree to lose sight of man, the individual, in man, the mass. I have no belief in spirituality. I think the word a mere word. No one has really a conception of spirit. We cannot imagine what is not. We deceive ourselves by the idea of infinitely rarefied matter. Matter escapes the senses by degrees: a stone, a metal, a liquid, the atmosphere, a gas, the luminiferous ether. Beyond that, there are other modifications more rare, but to all we attach the notion of a constitution of particles, atomic composition. For this reason only, we think spirit different. For spirit, we say, is unparticled, and therefore it is not matter. But it is clear that if we proceed sufficiently far in our ideas of rarefaction, we shall arrive at a point where the particle coalesce, for although the particle be infinite, the infinity of littleness in the spaces between them is an absurdity. The unparticled matter, permeating and impelling all things, is God. Its activity is the thought of God, which creates man and other thinking beings, are individualizations of the unparticled matter. Man exists as a person by being clothed with matter, the particled matter, which individualizes him. Thus habited, his life is rudimental. What we call death is the painful metamorphosis. The stars are the habitations of rudimental beings. But for the necessity of the rudimental life, there would have been no worlds. At death, the worm is the butterfly, still material, but of a matter unrecognized by our organs, recognized occasionally, perhaps, by the sleepwalker or waker, directly without organs, through the mesmeric medium. Thus, the sleepwalker may see ghosts. Divested of the rudimental covering, the being inhabits space, what we suppose to be the immaterial universe, passing everywhere and acting all things by mere volition, cognizant of all secrets but that of the nature of God's volition, the motion or activity of the unparticled matter. You speak of an estimate of my life, and from what I have already said, you will see that I have none to give. I have been too deeply conscious of the mutability and evanescence of temporal things to give any continuous effort to anything, to be consistent in anything. My life has been whim, impulse, passion, a longing for solitude, a scorn of all things present, and an earnest desire for the future. I am profoundly excited by music and by some poems, those of Tennyson especially, whom with Keats, Shelley, Coleridge occasionally, and a few others of like thought and expression, I regard as the soul poets. Music is the perfection of the soul or idea of poetry. The vagueness of exultation aroused by a sweet air which should be strictly indefinite and never too strongly suggestive is precisely what we should aim at in poetry. Affectation within bounds is thus no blemish. I still adhere to Dickens as either author or dictator of the review. My reasons would convince you could I give them to you, but I have left myself no space. I had 2 long interviews with Mr. Deutsch Kink when here. Nearly everything in the critique I heard from him or suggested to him personally. The poem of Emerson I read to him. I have been so negligent as not to preserve copies of any of my volumes of poems, nor was either worthy preservation. The best passages were culled in Hurst's article. I think my best poems, The Sleeper, The Conqueror Worm, The Haunted Palace, A Paean, Lenore, Dreamland, and the Colosseum, but all have been hurried and unconsidered. My best tales are Lygia, The Gold Bug, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, William Wilson, and The Descent into the Maelstrom. The Purloined Letter, forthcoming in The Gift, is perhaps the best of my tales of ratiocination. I have lately written for Godey, The Oblong Box, and Thou Art the Man, as yet unpublished. With this, I mail you The Gold Bug, which is the only one of my tales I have on hand. Graham has had for 9 months a review of mine on Longfellow's Spanish Student, which I have used up and in which I have exposed some of the grossest plagiarisms ever perpetrated. I can't tell why he does not publish it. I believe G intends my life for the September number, which will be made up by the 10th August. Your article should be on hand as soon as convenient. Believe me, your true friend, E.A. Poe. No one doubts the significance of the famous letter, and while it is regularly quoted, its 3 core paragraphs have escaped close analysis. But the letter is as difficult as it is important. It takes a signature and by no means transparent figurative turn. It gives special pertinence to some popular scientific concepts and phenomena, but only in a highly imaginative way. And it deploys 2 key terms, rudimental, and affectation, that require explanation. Poe opens with a paragraph deploring his fitful and disorderly habits. He is a man constantly swinging between extremes of industry and sloth. He does not mention how the rush of the age, Marginalia, December 1846, and its magazine literature, Marginalia, September 1845, have borne upon such a temperament, because the letter assumes the presence of that context. Indeed, Lowell's preceding letter has already touched on this matter. But Poe's temperament and condition are not a problem. He says, because I am not ambitious of worldly success. The remark is not candid. Poe labored hard, often unscrupulously, for financial success and stability, and he died still in pursuit of his most cherished cultural hope, to found and run a periodical of great literary distinction. If not candid on that matter, however, Poe is ambitious to be as candid and truthful as he can on other and perhaps more important issues. I live continually in a reverie of the future. I have no faith in human perfectibility. I think that human exertion will have no appreciable effect upon humanity. Man is now only more active, not more happy, not more wise than he was 6,000 years ago. The result will never vary, and to suppose that it will is to suppose that the foregone man has lived in vain, that the foregone time is but the rudiment of the future, that the myriads who have perished have not been upon equal footing with ourselves, nor are we our nor are we with our posterity. I cannot agree to lose sight of man, the individual, in man, the mass. I have no belief in spirituality. I think the word a mere word. The letter takes up three of Poe's most important intellectual preoccupations: the ethical situation of human beings in a mortal world, the conceptual matrix he built for himself to explain the soul body problem, a matrix he himself recognized to be conjectural and fashioned from a reverie of the future, and finally an idea about how poetry ought to be written, as the letter itself suggests. The three topics are closely related. Still got a long way to go. Poe's view that fundamental human nature has not and will not change over time is crucial. Foregone times and persons do not stand in a rudimentary relation to later times and persons, and perhaps least of all to times and persons like Poe's own, where progressivist ideas are, Poe thinks, deplorably pervasive. His rejection of moral progress and perfectibility makes him an especially problematic figure in the context of widespread American ideas about the exceptional individual person on the one hand, and reciprocally, the exceptional historical position, even moral position of the United States on the other. Whitman's cultural position reflects his commitment to both of those faces of American exceptionalism. Poe is not, however, echoing well established Christian ideas about the moral depravity of human nature, though famously contemptuous of what he called the mob. Poe's anti perfectibilian thought, is that even a fucking word? Anti perfectibilian? Come on now. Thought is even more democratic than the ideology and practice of democracy in historical America, as is clear, for instance, in a June 1849 marginalium where he distinguishes between a people and a mob. Poe did not see that people in the ancient world were any less or more moral or enlightened or intellectually capable than his contemporaries. Few men were more alert to the human capacity for deception and self deception, or to the power of human physical needs and desires, but to Poe, human illusions and desires fairly define the existential condition of conscious persons living in a material universe. Not only is there no depravity here, that limit condition of human being establishes the divinity proper to human being. For Poe, as for Shelley, God and divinity are human conceptions, though not human conditions except by desire, a desire realized in the execution of bodily thought. Poe's thinking here is very close to William Blake's idea that God is a man. Blake saw Jesus as the model of perfect human nature, and he expressed it in various ways. For example, God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. That Poe's thought runs along lines very similar to Blake's appears with special clarity in another marginalia from 1849. He that is born to be a man, says Wieland in his Peregrinus Proteus, neither should nor can be anything nobler. greater or better than a man. The fact is that in efforts to soar above our nature, we invariably fall below it. Your reformist demigods are merely devils turned inside out. Reformist demigods is, of course, an anti perfectibilian phrase directed at any number of contemporary political movements, including abolition. His regular derisive term for such things was transcendentalism. Important as the reference is, however, even more striking is how Poe expresses his ethical skepticism, which distinctly recalls famous moments in Blake, such as attempting to be more than man, we become less. Though not before noticed by either Blake or Poe scholars, the original Wyland passage, translated in 1796, seems to have been the point of reference for both. In Poe's secular, skeptical humanism, the idea of spirituality is materialized. Repeating in a letter to Thomas Holly Chivers, a month later, much of what he writes here to Lowell, Poe is even more emphatic on the question of a spiritual order. There is no such thing as spirituality. God is material, all things are material. To Thomas H. Chivers, July 10th, 1844. God is the unparticled matter permeating and impelling all things into their further individualizations of the unparticled matter. That is, into and as thinking human beings. The equality of God and man is a logical deduction from such a dynamical model, and the model pervades Poe's work, both theoretical and practical. So, for example, when Poe reflects critically on the commonplace idea of moral courage, he objects to a distinction the phrase might imply, as if there could be courage that was not moral. The codependence of body and soul, or mind and spirit, is so fundamental for him that he recommends the phrases bodily thought and muscular imagination, Marginalia, June 1849, to express its actions. Action. We want to remember, however, that Poe's argument, if it can be called that, is speculative, as he suggests when he sets his thoughts under the arresting assertion, I live continually in a reverie of the future. By reverie, a term that might well characterize the condition in which all his poetry operates, Poe means what in the sleeper he calls conscious slumber. As we have seen, he reflects at length on this poetic idea in the Marginalia from March 1846. Here it's enough to note the pertinence of the word future, which figures Poe's awareness of the not completely realized state of his speculations. Not that Poe means to argue a future where creative thought could achieve finality. Poe stole Shelley's famous image, the desire of the moth for the star, and turned it to a general theory of poetical action, as the phrase an earnest desire for the future here indicates. The word future is for him a political or historical term only by indirection. It is primarily a verbal image he deploys to transpose the word's chronological reference into spatial terms. So here it designates a determining feature of the So here it designates a determining feature of the geography of poetical pursuit, whose margin fades as Tennyson, Poe's other favorite contemporary poet, wrote, forever and forever as we move, Ulysses. In fact, figurative discourse organizes what Poe is writing in this letter. Poe's God is not a referential description, it is a figure of thought. We are prepared for such a transvaluation of linguistic ideological values when Poe tells us that he has no belief in spirituality. His brief accounts of divine and human creative actions, thoughts plainly reshape the known phenomenal world as a dynamic universe created by a God made in the image and likeness of Poe. longing to understand. In his case, that means to execute his own creative desire. Whereas the argument here is severely elliptical, it will get fully elaborated in Eureka, as we shall see. Natural philosophy and cosmology supplied Poe with a poetic vocabulary for executing and then reflecting on his thinking, including his thinking about the thinking of others, hence the pivotal importance of the marginalia and the corpus of his work. The marginalia itself comprises a general, indeed a generic figure of Poe's commitment to a process of perpetually decentered reflection on the world, which he makes accessible through its discourse fields. Although Poe does not believe in God or a supernatural order, he takes very seriously the importance of the discursive field in which both are determinate realities that affect and are affected by action in the historical world. The third part of the letter's long central paragraph puts Poe's method on full display. Recovering the key word rudimental and playing with the words habited and habitations, he sketches a cosmology, again to be elaborated in detail in Eureka, of secular humanism. The unparticled matter, permeating and impelling all things, is God. Its activity is the thought of God which creates. Man and other thinking beings are individualizations of the unparticled matter. Man exists as a person by being clothed with matter, the particled matter, which individualizes him. Thus habited, his life is rudimental. What we call death is the painful metamorphosis. The stars are the habitations of rudimental beings, but for the necessity of the rudimental life, there would have been no worlds. The word God thus names the primal energy of the material universe. When Poe describes this material creation as the thought of God, the preposition locates one of Poe's key figures of reciprocity. The universe is imagined simultaneously as the thought that God has and the thought that the material universe has of God. The distinction is at once reciprocal and rudimental. In other perspectives, thinking gets materially dispersed into man and other thinking beings, that is, into man and the thinking inhabitants of the universe of stars. As we know from both Al-Araf and Poe's celebrated angelic dialogues, he found it useful to imagine stars as the habitation of angels. And just as God and the universe stand in a reciprocal relation to each other, so too do men and angels. The relation is figured in the echoing words habited and habitations. Human beings, materially habited, are the inhabitants of the material worlds that orbit around their stars. When Poe populates those stars with angelic creatures, he is perpetuating the primal act of creation, the dispersal of materialized thinking. For Poe, committing thought to language, as in this letter, is a deep and complex material event. Poe's angels, Israfel, for instance, are figures of other ranges of thinking that he will use throughout his work as vehicles for investigating transmortal desire in his imaginative works. How many more pages? Damn, I still got a lot to go. So, another 6 pages. The two senses of the words rudimentary and rudimental define how reciprocity organizes the life world. That can't be a word. Life world? The life world Poe is imagining. Material existence in whatever form is a basic and essential condition of the life world in all its particled forms, OED, first meaning. At the same, I'm guessing that's the Oxford English Dictionary, At the same time, all of those forms are imperfect and in some stage of development or growth. Crucially, Poe is not arguing here that human history has a Hegelian structure, is not contradicting his initial anti-progressivist position. Poe Poe's reciprocal dynamic is strictly confined to the life world of the individual person. I cannot agree to lose sight of man the individual and man the mass. In that conception, he treats death as the termination of a person's life in order to explore the moral and psychic import of that event. For Poe, the problem of death is the problem of death in life, the individual's experience of irredeemable loss. To locate that personal experience in a more broad or more general context, in the context of history or philosophy, for example, is to lose or perhaps attempt to flee the experience of loss. The word death and its discourse field Poe's favorite territory can call us back to the painful metamorphosis. At death, the worm is the butterfly, still material, but of a matter unrecognized by our organs, recognized occasionally perhaps by the sleep-waker, directly without organs, through the mesmeric medium. Thus, the sleepwalker may see ghosts, divested of the rudimental covering the being inhabits space, what we suppose to be the immaterial universe, passing everywhere and acting all things by mere volition, cognizant of all secrets, but that of the nature of God's volition. A gloss on his tale, mesmeric revelation. This passage keys off its initial remark about the worm and the butterfly. Poe is thinking of the figure traditionally used as an analogy for transmortal passage, the change of state of the caterpillar to the butterfly. In Poe's mesmeric revelation, however, the human being, divested of the rudimental covering, enters a transorganic material condition where the rudimentary material transformation, caterpillar to butterfly, succeeds to its metaphysical realization. The identity of those two states of being. The former is a painful metamorphosis, whereas the latter, being inorganic, is not. The gap between act and the will to act, the temporality of cause and effect, is cancelled, or rather, spatially reorganized. The being inhabits space. The final paragraph then turns to the practical consequences of these conceptions about poetry. Poe's thought about the musical condition of poetry is spatialized. His keyword, harmony, represents the unity of effect that combinations of combinations build up within a poetic field. When he speaks, as he often does, of the undercurrent of meaning that poetry develops, he means that this pervasive harmony. In the best poetry, it is present everywhere, though a reader may only engage with it at different moments. His strongest proof for this view comes at the beginning of The Poetic Principle, where he declares that a long poem is a contradiction in terms. I am profoundly excited by music and by some poems, those of Tennyson especially, with whom, with Keats, Shelley, Coleridge occasionally, and a few others of like thought and expression, I regard as the soul poets. Music is the perfection of the soul, or idea, of poetry, the vagueness of exultation aroused by a sweet air which should be strictly indefinite and never too strongly suggestive, is precisely what we should aim at in poetry. Affectation within bounds is thus no blemish. The sweet air is the index of the harmony of the composition as a whole. In the words of the Marginalia of April 1849, the conception of sweet sounds simply, Poe's final remark, is thus both arresting and deeply pertinent. Affectation in poetry. We recognize it principally as poetic wit, is the manifestation of artistic effort. He recurs to the matter in a comment on Barrett Browning's poetry. The thoughts here belong to a high order of poetry, but could not have been wrought into effective expression without the aid of those repetitions, those unusual phrases, those quaintnesses, in a word which it has been too long the fashion to censor indiscriminately under the one general head of affectation. Famously deploring Shelley's poetry when it has a palpable design upon us, Keats made a plea for romantic sincerity. If people, or if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. Sympathizing with both poets, Poe recognizes the importance of a palpable poetic design so long as it isn't a moral or thematic design. It must be the palpable presence of the poem's musical conception, a theme in a musical sense simply. 7. Marginalia, January 1848. If any ambitious man have a fancy to revolutionize at one effort the universal world of human thought, human opinion, and human sentiment, the opportunity is his own. The road to immortal renown lies straight, open, and unencumbered before him. All that he has to do is to write and publish a very little book. Its title should be simple, a few plain words, my heart laid bare, but this little book must be true to its title. Now, is it not very singular that with the rabid thirst for notoriety which distinguishes so many of mankind, so many too who care not a fig what is thought of them after death, there should not be found one man having sufficient hardihood to write this little book? To write, I say. There are 10,000 men who, if the book were once written, would laugh at the notion of being disturbed by its publication during their life, and who could not even conceive why they should object to its being published after their death. But to write it, there is the rub. No man dare write it. No man ever will dare write it. No man could write it. Even if he dared, the paper would shrivel and blaze at every touch of the fiery pen. Reading this now, we necessarily read it through Baudelaire, who began writing Mon Coeur Misenu in the early 1860s to test the truth of Poe's challenge. As we know, Baudelaire finally abandoned the work, leaving it behind him unpublished and uncompleted. We may easily imagine that he did this deliberately or perhaps fatefully in homage to this Sibylline text that set his failed projects going, and to the man who charmed him into it, for who could look into his heart and publish the whole truth of what he saw there. Bold spirits have imagined such an exploit. Poe did, so did Baudelaire. More blithe spirits, perhaps Sir Philip Sidney, advised poets to do it. It cannot be done, Poe finally declares. Catastrophe will intervene. Why, we wonder, thinking of Poe the man, we might surmise that he couldn't face the full truth of his lies, his follies, his plagiarisms, his hypocrisies. All in all, the sum of his failures, which were legion. But that is exactly not what this marginalium leads us to consider. However daring or however shameless the person might be, such a book, we are told, is in itself impossible, and impossible as the fulfillment of the desire of the moth for the star. The force of this marginalium's arresting final sentence hangs upon the mounting rhetoric of the passage. The marginalium is perhaps not exactly the test it appears to be. Poe is clearly playing with his reader, tempting him, to imagine he could take, an exact measure of himself. his powers, his courage, his ambition, his self-awareness. The tease is also a provocation to move the interested reader. His interest fully engaged by the second paragraph, to imagine not whether he might possibly make himself more than equal to the ancient challenge to know thyself, but to make that knowledge public. So the text keeps affecting to wonder and to keep us wondering. If there might be someone out there, me, who, having a yen for immortal renown, would do whatever were necessary to gain it. Poe would surely have remembered that Milton called fame the last infirmity of noble minds. Biographers tell us that Poe can imagine such an intrepid spirit because that spirit is his own imagined self. The judgment seems to me warranted, but its relevance here has less to do with Poe than with the reader Poe's text is calling out. We read this marginalium with an eagerness equal to Poe's perverse intention to call upon that eagerness. Baudelaire took the bait and then, some years later, let it go. If we meet Poe's perversity with perversity, we might recall here the end of Song of Myself and think, has Poe stopped here, somewhere, anywhere, waiting for me? Surely he has. And so, taking the lead from Baudelaire, we might say to Poe, Hypocrite, scriptur mon semblable, mon frere. The writer-reader reciprocity is one of the thoughts concealed in this riddling text. But the final sentence pushes us to consider that in this impossible quest for truth or fame, one's personal gifts or failings are beside the point. Nor is the daring spirit stopped by some external power. The catastrophe evoked in the final sentence is fearful because it isn't a consummation. It is a beginning, an initiative, or an initiation, pardon. The desire of the moth for the star suddenly appears as the desire of the moth for the flame, a figuration Poe, like Shelley, knew through its wide transmission in Persian poetry. But in sharp contrast to that tradition, is Poe transforming it through recollections of Jehovah? The flame is the agent of its own catastrophic energy. In Persian poetry, even the poetry of Rumi, where the soul's flame has the power to extinguish the candle and the sun itself rather than vice versa, the event represents the extinction of the self and its world of illusions. That event thus brings a promise of unimaginable benevolence, which is the cherished tone of Rumi's poetry. But in Poe's figuration, the agent of desire is not consumed. Poe's fiery finger writes annihilation, and having writ, moves on. It is difficult not to think here of the endless catastrophe that is the ultimate revelation of Eureka. I would agree, except I've never read Eureka. And that's the end of that chapter. And my reading. Goodbye, perhaps.